Hey guys, welcome back. This is the first review of 2019. Hope you all had a wonderful holiday. Happy New Year. The first review of the new year is going to be Netflix's new film, Bandersnatch, a Black Mirror event. I'm a big fan of the Black Mirror series, and this was kind of a departure from the normal format. This is a film where they're trying to give you kind of a choose-your-own-adventure vibe. And this review will hopefully tell you whether you should choose to undertake this adventure or not.
I don't know what to say.
Typically, I'm a really big fan of the Black Mirror series. It's sort of like a Twilight Zone anthology, but it's in the new generation because what it really incorporates are elements of technology and sort of how technology can be the harbinger of things both good and bad. It sort of plays out the implications of both. And some people have come to me and said they think that Black Mirror is sort of Twilight Zone for dummies. And I'll be completely honest, what I like about Black Mirror is sometimes you can get really quickly what analog they're going for or what metaphor they're trying to explain, but they bring a new element to that conversation, to things that we should really be thinking about as we move forward in the 21st century. Some of my favorite episodes would be White Bear, Shut Up and Dance. There's some really good episodes like White Christmas that are similar to Bandersnatch in that they're sort of one-offs. They're self-contained, a little bit longer, and kind of like short-form movies. And since Black Mirror moved from BBC to Netflix, you've been seeing a continuation of that, where episodes go closer to an hour and longer, whereas the earlier episodes are more of your hour-long, 42-minute TV episodics. What's interesting about Bandersnatch is it's really an attempt to create something that's brand new. And I know that Netflix has been experimenting with Choose Your Own Adventure series on the platform, and I think it's a really interesting idea. It's a way to engage with your audience and give them more of kind of a say in how the action goes down. And going back to what I said when we were talking about Prototype, there's something a little bit difficult when you're trying to create that sort of fourth dimensional relationship with the audience where they can partake. And what Prototype did is they did that through 3 dimensions. You're kind of engaging with it and bringing more of your perception to the film to influence what it is you're experiencing. The Choose Your Own Adventure format was an interesting experiment, I think, to show the power of Netflix as a platform and how the home viewing experience can be broadened moving forward. And Black Mirror, I think, was the perfect vehicle for them to test this further. What is Bandersnatch? Bandersnatch is a movie following a computer programmer, a video game programmer in the 80s, in 1984 fittingly, who is creating a video game that is based on a book called Bandersnatch. And what the book is all about is it's one of those classic choose your own adventure types where you read to a certain point, you get a decision tree, you choose which direction you want to go and flip to that page and kind of see how things go. As somebody who grew up reading those books, like Choose Your Own Nightmare, I think it was called, or Choose Your Own Horror, whatever it was in the 90s, I really enjoyed that concept growing up, and seeing it translate to the big screen was something I was very excited to see. What I would say is this: the acting is pretty good, the story is interesting enough to get you invested, and I didn't find any of the engagement through the remote and choosing your own path to be that inhibiting on the viewing experience. However, what I felt was kind of limiting in this film is that you are left with so many decision trees where it's kind of like a video game, right? You reach that decision tree moment and people are kind of staring idly at each other into the camera as a clock is ticking down and asking you to make a decision. And that can pull you out a little bit because it's really reminding you just how much this is sequenced off and all these moments are kind of separated and meant to be separate. And if you make your decisions rather quickly or impulsively, you're left sitting there for 5 or 6 seconds while people kind of and then follow to their next line of dialogue based on what you chose. And it can be a little bit disjarring and a little bit awkward. What's interesting about this is that a good awareness of choosing your own adventure pathing is that everything should flow kind of seamlessly from one point to the next, but you're also learning more about the story through your failures as much as you are through your successes. And what is a failure in this context? Well, there are several points in the movie where if you choose the wrong path, or if you do something that isn't intended to happen, it will give you an ending or a point at which your character fails and you are brought back to an earlier decision point to kind of rectify that. And what makes this episode interesting is there's such self-awareness that it kind of builds in your character's familiarity with that repetition that it breaks the fourth wall a little bit. You've got characters who are kind of aware of the fact that these timelines are split. And it's a very good way of Black Mirror to incorporate that while fleshing out the characters and giving you sort of that existential dread of these characters having almost an awareness that they're part of a story. And the way that they explain that is that some characters are aware of parallel timelines. The biggest problem with that is if there's going to be that kind of continuity and these characters are aware of the repetition, you would expect a little bit more from them in terms of understanding and predicting what they need to do moving forward, or taking different actions to predict and anticipate events that might come to follow. Sort of like in Groundhog's Day. Bill Murray wakes up, and the more he becomes familiar with that day, the more he can alter those events in advance to create more positive outcomes. Earlier on in the film, there are moments where it seems as if the character and a particular side character are very aware of the alternate timelines and are aware that they've been through these moments before. And it almost seems as if one of the characters has changed their behavior to have more understanding and more knowledge to come to the same point, which makes you wonder whether or not you're part of a sequencing going back to a beginning, or somebody who is the same person all throughout, looping back and continuing forward. So if you think about it like time travel, for instance, you've got kind of two possibilities. One is this parallel dimension where characters just happen to be taking different directions, and you're seeing how that plays out. But in a movie like Primer, for instance, you can imagine a main character who moves forward to a certain point, goes back in time and revisits those moments, but it's the same character all throughout with that enhanced knowledge. And this film kind of can't decide whether it wants to go in the latter path or not. There are moments where when you repeat the film or you repeat certain sequences, the character still seems very unaware of certain things that will befall them given certain decisions. And Netflix does have a lot of fun with the medium and the format, in the sense that if you choose certain directions and your impact on the story as a viewer is more prominent and the character becomes more aware of you as sort of an omniscient third party, the story can get very crazy, very wild, and very comical. And those are events that you're used to in sort of choose your own adventure stories, where the hyperbole becomes more of the centerfold and kind of the goal of what you're seeing. So there are some very funny moments, typically those that come right before a failed ending, that are enjoyable and subvert expectations and really mess with the idea of what entertainment is supposed to be, and particularly in this medium, in this format. That was pretty effective for me. The problems that I had with this were when you get booted back to that main storyline and you continue forward, it does feel at certain points like a bad game of D&D where your DM or your game master is telling you like, yeah, you're having fun, cool, but here's your mission, here's your objective. You really do have to talk to this orc in this tavern, otherwise you can't continue the story because I haven't really planned out the alternate paths. So it gives you the illusion of choice, but really it's kind of streamlining you back to one central path. And I understand why that has to be for a narrative purpose. And that's been happening in video games for decades now. One of my favorite series, for instance, is Mass Effect, and you have the illusion of all of these different choices you can make that impact the galaxy and the universe. But a common complaint with the ending of the last game was, regardless of what you did, you might have certain things kind of altered on your way to the finale, but the finale is different whether you did 100% of the things you could do or the bare minimum. It really kind of funnels you back to a central ending. And Bandersnatch is kind of similar in that way. What is interesting is that the more divergent paths you take, the more information you learn, the more you flesh yourself out about your character and his motivations. And that's really good for a characterization study. And one of the key methods they use is kind of like a video game where it'll kind of grade your outcome in the sense of the main character is making this video game, and if you have a really poor outing, it'll say the game was a complete catastrophe or a failure, 0 stars out of 5. And that kind of gives you some feedback like, okay, I've got some work to do, I can do more, I can be better. 2 stars, 4 stars, et cetera, et cetera. It gives you a goal that you want to have both conclusion and ending to the story, but you also want the game to be a 5 out of 5. It's kind of this incentive that it's given you within the story. Part of the frustration that I felt, at least, was while you do have options and choice, they're always binary, and some are obviously wrong, some seem to be right, and while it does subvert those expectations to an extent, as you get funneled closer and closer to the ending, you feel like you have to choose some of the bad outcomes where you really wish there would be some sort of an in-between option or other choices that you could make that you think would be more logical. Especially because at a certain point in the story, the character does seem to be fully aware of you there again as an interloper who's interfering with their story and their life. As with any good episode of Black Mirror, this gimmick or this story or this atmosphere isn't really there just for the sake of itself. It really is there to be fleshed out by story mechanics and philosophy that it's introducing to the ideas. And part of that comes through the main character and one of his counterparts at the video game company who explore the idea of alternate timelines, who explore the meaning of kind of what they're experiencing and the nature of the reality around them. And that's very interesting to a point, but again, it does feel later on in the story like all of that's sort of irrelevant. And I guess what I mean by that is, at the end of the movie, when I talked to my friends about it, I said it was a really enjoyable experience, But if you really think about explaining the linear story of it, and there is a linear story by the end of it, it's a very short story. So it almost feels like a 20 to 30 minute episode that's expanded out to an hour or an hour and a half, just because of all these garden paths that kind of go out and give you some extra content and loop you right back into the main story. Another thing that I noticed, at least, is when I got to the end of the movie, I had a certain ending that I felt was very fitting to the story and felt very within the canon and tradition of Black Mirror. That can be very sad, very effective, and very resonant. It makes you feel kind of guilty for all of your interloping, and it almost makes you feel like the character is doomed from the start, which can give you a sense of dread to it. What I've heard is that there is a true ending or a better ending that has the full credit sequence at the end that is a little bit darker. It's definitely different and more cyclical with the inner workings of the story itself, particularly the connection between Bandersnatch the book, Bandersnatch the game, and what is meant to happen after your character begins kind of interfering in this timeline. Similarly to how you can sort of choose this adventure, I was left feeling like I could choose my own ending in this sense, and I was actually happier with my 90% ending than I think I would have been had I gotten the complete ending that some of my friends got. So there definitely is some freedom in that sense to interpret the story as you'd like. But the biggest thing to me is to remember that Bandersnatch is really more of an experiment with the medium. It's really more about executing this concept and seeing if that can be enjoyable for the viewer and creating a unique experience. It's not a movie that you're going to walk away really thinking more about as the sum of its own parts. It's really more about that experience. So if you're looking for a great story, I wouldn't say that it's there, but if you're looking for a good experience that really bridges the gap between film and game, I think that's absolutely what I got out of this and what I expected. I'd like to see Netflix and even Black Mirror do a little bit more with this format. I'm not sure if Black Mirror would be better served to go back to it at any point or if they really kind of got everything out of it that they could, but it really showed the possibilities for this format. The downsides, like I said, are you do feel a little bit limited. It does sort of pull you out of the immersion of the story, and I don't know if I would have enjoyed it as much if your interference in the story weren't such a prominent element and component of the thematics of this piece to itself. In other words, if I was watching an Avengers movie or a Transformers movie and it was, should the character do A or B, I don't really know if that would work when it comes strictly down to your personal preference or to immediate gratification without the awareness that my interference really holds some weight and some value to it. And I think that the way Black Mirror presented it accomplished that. At the end of the day, it is a choose-your-own-adventure story, so let's make it a choose-your-own review. You've heard what I had to say. If you like it, go see it. If you don't like what you've heard and you don't want to be sitting there with your remote figuring out how you can direct the story, don't go see it.